Howdy. How are you? Okay, so this is the mixing stage, part 2 of a larger video that I made, where I did like a whole forensic sort of study on what gear they used and what mic positions they used in the Radiohead basement sessions, and then I recreated weird fishes based off of that sort of analysis. I got way more comments than I ever thought I would ever get about doing a mixing part 2 video. Also, today is the Puerto Rican Day Parade, so if you hear that, it's because it's right over there. So here's the project file. Let me quickly go through my basic structure. Many of you will already know this, but a lot of you are brand new, so maybe you won't. All of the drums are in purple with a master drum group. The bass is just one bass, so no group. All the vocals are in this kind of like cyan green, all in an individual group. Same thing with Tom's guitar, same thing with Johnny's guitar, and same thing with Ed's guitar. But just as importantly as all the processing going on these groups, all of these tracks here at the bottom marked A, B, C, D, and E, these are return tracks, and they are just as important, if not more important, as the processing going on the individual tracks. So if you're unfamiliar with how these return tracks work, let's go to the other page here. Don't worry about it if this looks overwhelming to you. All I need you to focus on are these A, B, C, D, and E knobs. They correspond directly to the A, B, C, D, E return tracks over here. So for example, let's take this snare, which is mic'd with an SM57. You can see here that a good amount of the signal, like 80% of it, is going to parallel drums. That means there is a parallel compression track on this send, and that return send is affecting the tone of that snare just as much as the actual EQ on the snare. So you can see on the track we have a ratio of 10:1 on the compressor, and then that's going into an EQ that's boosting the mid-range. That's a very aggressive ratio, meaning for every 10 decibels in, it's going to squash it down to 1 decibel out. This kind of compression should really only be saved for something like a return track. This aggressive of a compression ratio placed on the actual instrument itself, it's just going to be unusable. But when you mix it to taste, then suddenly these more extreme tones make more sense. So let's hear the snare with and without this track. Just makes it a little bit more full. So with that in mind, now that I've kind of emphasized how important these return tracks are, let's hear the entire track and then compare it to with all the return tracks on and with all the return tracks off.
In the deepest ocean, bottom of the sea, in the deepest ocean, bottom of the sea.
I will say, hearing that, it is more subtle than it normally is in my mixing tracks. Actually, a lot of the moves that I did in this mix are more subtle than normal, just because I thought the raw takes were so usable. Okay, so let's go over the drums first. First thing to note is that the rack tom and the floor tom aren't used. So let's hear it with and without the floor tom so you can hear how those sympathetic tones affected the overall tone. Much tighter. Okay, first and foremost, let's go over the overheads. Nothing special here at all. I just kind of boosted the high end to give a little bit more shimmer to the overheads tone. I know that's not quite the darker sound that the original Coles 4038s would have gotten as an overhead mic, but we thought bringing out the liveliness in these overheads really complemented things like the snare and all the other things that the overheads were picking up. And namely, really important there, the overhead center, which was this Lauten Clarion mic, really brought out the fullness of the snare as well. I highly recommend this sort of center overhead, specifically more for a snare mic than anything. Let's hear it with and without that center overhead. You can see here, what we're really doing whenever we're beefing up this mid-range is beefing up that snare more than we are making like a traditional overhead EQ. And we're even treating this compressor that I have here more of a compressor for the snare than the overheads. Look how it's reacting. Not subtle. So on that snare hit, it's really leveling that tone out a lot, which means we kind of have two snare mics here. Now, in terms of the snare itself, we actually use the virtual mix rack for it, but really all it is a separate compressor, a 3 or 4 band EQ, and then we're adding a little bit of shimmer and thickness through whatever this is. I don't really know, but it does a great job. So I also want to emphasize how important this specific EQ was. Now, if you don't recognize this as an EQ, I understand, especially if we're used to like a parametric EQ, right? Where all the graph is kind of shown as that line. But you see here, we select the frequency range we want to use, in this case, 3.2 kilohertz, and then we boost it, and it's showing how much we're boosting it. So we're boosting it around 7 decibels. Let's hear that snare with and without that EQ. So different. And a lot of the reasons why that sounds the way it does is because of this sort of 7 decibel boost at 3.2 kilohertz. And then we're going to whatever compressor this is, I don't even know. But the biggest thing to take away from this is we have a pretty aggressive threshold affecting everything around -30 decibels and up. We have a ratio of 4:1, but a lot of the harmonic information is being affected by that because of the threshold that we've set. And then finally, we have this shimmer and thicken effect. I don't even really know what it does. I threw on a bunch of plugins and I found ones that I thought added a nice sort of sheen to the snare. So let's hear it with and without it. Okay, so the kick was really cool. Really standard stuff when it comes to compression. All it was really set at is around a 3:1 ratio. Listen to kind of the thump that we get with this compressor. And this is a really standard EQ. I just cut some of the highs, cut the lows, and then boosted where that kick drum would lie in the mix. Really, it's a lot of the sort of treatment that we gave to the kick beforehand, padding it, and really just a good mic. And then all of that is just going through a little bit more compression and then maybe boosting a little bit of the upper mid-range on this group bus, on this drum group bus. That's kind of a thing that you're gonna notice on here because we're really just trying to be as accurate to the Radiohead recording as possible and be tasteful with these sort of mixing decisions. A lot of this is just a calculated amount of compression going from the track itself, then going to the group, mixed in with the return tracks, and then finally kind of glued together in the master. It's mostly smart use of compression along all the different sort of gain stages. The bass here, there's really one thing I want to talk about, but it's very important. If you check out the bass line, wow, that is so loud. We're gonna keep going. So if you check out the bass line, you'll notice that it's really pretty sparse. One hit being held for 4 measures at a time sometimes. And also, when you look at these waveforms, obviously towards the end of the hit here, there's going to be less bass. There's going to be less strength in that note because the initial attack was, 5 seconds away by this point. So how do we get more bass from the end of these hits? Like the same amount of bass that we would get from the top of these hits? Well, friends, your answer is always with release and attack. You can see here that the release is set to 4.5 seconds. What that means is it's not going to stop compressing until 4.5 seconds after the end of the note. Really hard to think like this, guys. Like, I'm sure it's funny on the video, but also it's really hard to explain things when there's a parade next to you. Okay, so the reason that's important, remember what compression does, makes the louder signals and the quieter signals more similar to each other. So if we're compressing for 4.5 seconds with that release time, that means the tail of this 4.5 seconds later is still going to be a much more similar volume to the beginning, the initial attack, where all the bass kind of typically is. So when you have these really long extended bass lines, these extended bass hits, things that are always on the root note or, where the bass is just holding down the harmonic information, setting a really long release in, a pretty aggressive ratio, maybe like a 7/8 that's gonna give you a lot more bass presence, even at the very end of that tail on the note. So let's hear it with and without that compressor. And that might seem like a simple sort of technique, but it is incredibly effective and very important. Alrighty, right. Let's go over guitars. We're actually not going to spend a lot of time on guitars because there's really not much going on besides EQ and compression. So first, let's start off with tom. All it is, guys, is just EQ and compression. I bumped up the mid-range to give it a little bit more presence, and then I compressed it kind of at a standard like 3-to-1 ratio. And that's kind of the frustrating thing about this tutorial now that I'm doing it, and now that I'm kind of in the weeds. This is just a lot of, I suppose, smart use of EQ and compression. Because if we go to Johnny now, on the one main Johnny guitar, we have a pretty enclosed EQ. You can see here that we've completely kind of eviscerated all the high end of that strat to make it sit well in the mix and to give the vocals more room. Let's hear it with and without that EQ. So the problem there was because we're using position 4 on the Strat, but position 4 is just a bright, jangly, out of phase tone, especially compared to that original mix, and because we needed to give most of that high-end presence to the vocal. Everything should serve the vocal in these kinds of songs, so if you need to cut harmonic information out of the high end, cut it out of the guitars for the most part. Same thing with Ed. This is the same EQ that we have on Tom, actually, and the same compressor. Yo, what is going on? All right, so going into this vocal, there's really two vocal chains. There's the one that's kind of on the outro and in the meat of the verse and the choruses. And then there's the quiet part in the middle, the bridge, where all of the drums cut out. Two different chains with two different tones and two different reverbs too. There's a really wet, huge reverb on the main sort of take in the intro and the outro. And then on the bridge in the middle, there's basically no reverb. There's a little bit, like 8 point.
In the deepest ocean, bottom of the sea. In the deepest ocean, bottom of the sea. I get eaten by the worm. Wet fishes. I get eaten by the worm. Wet fishes.
So for the vocal, there are 4 main things affecting it. The first one is an EQ that is very dark, much darker than the original vocal take. So let's hear it with that EQ and without it.
In the deepest ocean, in the deepest ocean.
So we first have a high shelf cutting about 8 decibels off of the high end already. Then we're cutting around 700 hertz, about 5 decibels, and then boosting a little bit around 2.2 kilohertz. It's a really dark chain, which to me contributed to the kind of mellow, relaxing, easy listening vibe to the mix. Not only that, but because we left a lot of the harmonic information out on the guitars, you saw how destructive those EQs were, especially on Johnny's guitar, in a good way. We have a lot of creative freedom to kind of mold the vocal how we want it to be. So then we're going into an LA2A sort of emulator. And if you know the LA2A, it's probably like the second most famous compressor after the 1176. And it's super easy. All you really got to do is put in the amount of reduction you want and the amount of gain. And you can see here we're reducing around 7 decibels on average and boosting it up a little bit.
In the deepest ocean, in the deepest ocean.
Then we just have a couple things that I kind of picked, not really knowing what they're doing. This is adding shimmer and thickness. I thought it was pretty accurate. And then whatever this thing does, which adds a bit of a high sort of breathiness.
In the deepest ocean, in the deepest ocean.
So this is adding a ton of breath, which I really love. I don't know what this is. I just chose it. And then let's talk about the chain that I built for the bridge. Still a very dark EQ, less compression and definitely less of that sort of breathy sort of compression vibe that we're getting from those plugins that we're getting on the Slate chain. But again, what's really important about this is because we were so sort of subtle with the guitars, chopping away a lot of the high end of those guitars, the vocal has a ton of sort of room, which means these pretty huge reverbs that we have going here, they really get a chance to shine, you know? Then last but not least, I have the mastering chain on the master. Let's hear it with and without that mastering chain.
In the deepest ocean, bottom of the sea. In the deepest ocean, bottom of the sea.
So the first thing is one of my favorite plugins of all time, TDR Kotelnikov. This is a free mastering compressor that has some of the nicest, most tasteful mastering EQs that I've come across. But here you can see with the Kotelnikov on and nothing else, here's what it sounds like. And it will be subtle. It's a mastering plugin, so it'll be subtle.
In the deepest ocean, bottom of the sea. In the deepest ocean, bottom of the sea.
But a big thing is just setting the preset to kind of barely kiss on the maximum level and then reduce around 1 decibel, even like just 2 on the loudest parts in order to just kind of glue it together subtly. We have the Gullfoss Master. If you're not familiar with Gullfoss, love this plugin. It's an intelligent EQ. It's really cool. Based on the parameters you give it, when it hears kind of a resonant frequency, you get too far out of control, it'll duck it down. A Make It Loud compressor that is pretty self-explanatory. TDR Nova, which is another one of my plugins that I love. What it's doing here is after a certain threshold, it's a dynamic EQ. I have a whole video on dynamic EQs if you want to jump into that. When it gets a little bit too intense in the 200 hertz range, it's just gonna duck it out, maybe like 3 decibels. We're not trying to do anything to save the mix in the mastering stage. Your mix, if it sounds like trash going into the master track, it will still sound like trash whenever you put your mastering chain on. This is all about kind of regulating frequencies, making sure that one specific area of the mix isn't too insane, making sure that your volume is under control. And when you get it to the mixing stage, that should really be a matter of 1 or 2 decibels of reduction depending on whatever process you're doing. Then just a limiter to make sure we don't clip. I don't even think this is necessary in the song. It's just a habit to add a limiter. Really, it's a pretty uneventful mix. A lot of it is tasteful uses of EQ and compression and leaving a lot of room for the vocal. I don't really think that this vocal chain is that special. I know there was a lot of people asking about this vocal chain, but what's special is that we left so much harmonic information for the vocal to occupy. Remember to be smart and use your return tracks to affect how the mix sounds. These are a really powerful tool to be non-destructive towards your original processing. You can use these and mix them to taste and not worry about destroying your original take. With the mastering, the move should be subtle. Don't go crazy on the mastering chain in some sort of like last ditch effort to save your mix. If it's at this point, it's still gonna be fucked. I hope that was helpful. It is insanely loud in my room right now. I am gonna go somewhere else. Man, I hope this tutorial turned out okay. I think my game was a little thrown off. Anyways, thank you so much. See you next time.